Welcome to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe Onoha.
And I'm Cheta Wanze.
Today we have a very, very special guest on our Black Paper interview series. We're fortunate to have the amazing, legendary, I must add, David Weaver with us. David Weaver is a former social worker, senior local government manager, university lecturer, political advisor to two senior government ministers during the Blair Brown transition. He's currently the senior partner of DWC Consulting, a leadership and change management practice, working with elected members through the local government association. And I must add that was where I first met David, and we struck up an interesting conversation. From 2016 to 2023, he was president of the British Association of Counseling and Psychotherapy. He joined the Operation Black Vote Board in 2018 and has served as chair since. Now, that is an unusual combination of experience. He has worked inside frontline public service, inside Whitehall, inside local government, and inside civil society. So he's done it all. He has advised ministers, he has trained future professionals, and when he talks about the Black communities and Black voting experience, he knows his stuff. Operation Black Vote was founded in 1996 on the proposition that closing the democratic deficit between Black communities' political weight and their actual representation is a central task. Now, after 30 years, that proposition is under more pressure than at any point in the organization's history. So today on the Black Paper, we want to talk with David Weaver on his experiences, on some of his current musings on the state of the Black vote and their relationship with political parties, and just his experience and see how we can tap from that as the Black Paper, given that we were founded to look at the same, largely or broadly the same principles of how to get our communities more engaged, more informed, and more active. Welcome, David Weaver.
Thanks very much, and thanks for that very generous introduction. Thank you.
All right, so just to hit it off, David, you've spent your career trying to bring Black communities into political mainstream, whether as a social worker or as a local government manager, or even when you were advising ministers. And now you're chair of Operation Black Vote. So I think in the first instance, just let us know what Operation Black Vote is and how, given what your personal mission has been, what the organization's mission has been, where you are right now. Are you energized, exhausted, angry, or just passive?
Not passive, but the rest of it. Well, I'm actually honored because I'm one of the co-founders of Operation Black Vote, and actually this is our 30th year. We're celebrating our 30th year, and perhaps for yourselves, we'll talk about what we have planned and what we've been doing in this 30th year, because it's a seminal moment. The reason why Operation Black Vote was established was on the back of other organizations that we were part of. What we began to realize is that we were winning the argument, but losing the battle. What do I mean by that? I meant that we could go up and down the country, we could speak to politicians, we could speak to civil society and talk about the rightness and the wrongness of what they're doing, the rightness of the fight for equity, social justice, inclusion, anti-racism, and the wrongness of what they were doing. But what we were finding is that whilst we were winning those arguments, we were losing it because we weren't voting. Black people not registering to vote, and they were not voting. And that is still the case, although there's been some improvements. If you're not registering to vote, politicians don't have to listen to you. If you're not voting or voting strategically, then the status quo continues. So you may have heard the mantra that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's very much why we were established. And what we have found over the years is that there are more Black communities that are realizing that we do have the power of the vote, that in local areas and even in the last elections, you'll find when you look at the analysis of it, the Black vote has made a difference. Whether we vote or whether we don't vote, it's made a difference. And that, and we can continue talking about this, has been our aim and our goal. We've had some successes along the way, Operation Black Vote has also been responsible for programs that have meant that we're more represented where it matters. So we have a significant number of our alumni who have gone through Operation Black Vote programs, who are members of parliament, who are magistrates, who are local councillors. And that's where I met you, Ndukwe. So that work continues, but it's even more important now, where we see what's happening around the normalization of racism. And there's a frustration in our communities because many of us feel it's going back, but there's a frustration there. And that's why it's so important that we've got to continue the fight. We've got to continue to get our people who are ethical, because, our skin folk aren't necessarily our kinfolk. We've seen many situations where people like us have gone into power, but have not represented our interests, and sometimes have become what I call black cladding, that they are the buffer and they are become the excuse for parties feeling that they can do what they're doing because white people couldn't get away with it either. Notwithstanding that, there are more people like us who are really wanting to fight, who have that leadership potential, who need to be, who should be, who need to be encouraged to be part of the leadership within our society.
Okay, thanks so much for this for this expansive answer, David. You've said two things that have jumped out at me. So first, and this is something that this is part of the reason we actually started this podcast. If you're not registering to vote, politicians are not listening to you. I think that's very important, and before I even go to ask any question, it's a very important message to hammer to our community, because it's a mistake that we made back home, back in our origin countries. So many African communities, and I suspect many Caribbean communities, have suffered from this sort of indifference to the democratic process. So a lot of people don't register to vote. A lot of people don't take part. A lot of people register to vote, for example, specifically in Nigeria. A lot of people register to vote just to get the voters card as a cheap identity card. But on election day, they will not come out to vote. And so it's important for us to hammer this message. If you are not registering to vote, politicians will not listen to you. But the second thing that you said you talked about the normalization of racism. And I mean, we can see it. It's not something to be denied. There was somebody who made a tweet the other day, after the England squad, the World Cup was announced, and talked about the race of the players. But in the past, you have specifically accused Labour of accepting the normalization of racism. So can you expand on this point? Explain what you mean by that. Explain why Labour specifically. And because in my view, normalization implies something that is more structural than individual bad decisions. So is it, and this is bearing in mind that we started this podcast after a Labour Home Secretary published a white paper that basically many in our community would see as racists. So are you saying that Labour has made a conscious calculation that anti-Black racism is politically acceptable collateral damage?
I mean, I focused my attention on Labour because they were in government. That's the first thing. But also, secondly, because our communities have traditionally voted for Labour. So when I do that, that is not to put them aside from the other political parties that are doing the same thing. So just earlier, I was listening to the Sky breakfast show, and Trevor Phillips was facilitating that, and there was a conversation across the political parties about the boats and immigration and so forth, and the manner in which they all spoke in accepting even the premise that it is okay to blame those people for cost of living, for the National Health Service, and these people have come into this country and do not want to integrate, and that they speak about our parents' generation in their 70s and their 80s, and further into their 90s, who came into this country and gave so much and have a right to be here. The normalization of a conversation about them as us as outsiders is worrying. And that was taking place across all of the parties. But to answer your question directly, Labour have a particular responsibility because they've always had our vote. They've always had our vote. And when you see the spectre of legislation going through, which is going for judge-only trials, taking away jurors, where it is already known that there's a disproportionate wrong side of the fence of Black people in terms of policing, the criminal justice system, health and social care, and all the rest of it. But in terms of criminal justice, that we're on the wrong side of that. The spectre of taking away juries means that it's a white system. It's a white-only system. Only 1% of judges are Black. So you just hear this happening all the time. And the Labour government are not pushing forward with some of the things that they said they were going to push forward on. And in the eyes of many people that we communicate with up and down the country, there is a pandering to the right. There is a pandering to the views that they feel most people have in society, which is anti-people like us. And that is not helping us.
Okay, thank you so much. You've said something in your response about Black voters traditionally voting Labour, and the data actually backs that up. Black voters have remained among Labour's most loyal groups, even in the last general election in 2024. But it's clear that something has changed in the last council elections. So that's a very short time for that kind of change to happen. And we had a survey. We did a survey before the elections, which I believe Ndukwe shared with you. And our results showed that a lot of people were actually planning to abandon Labour. A lot of people within our community, and most of them were moving towards the Greens. So in your view, what specifically happened between July 2024 and now to break the hold that the Labour Party had on Black and ethnic minority voters?
Well, I'd say that most voters have felt the same thing, that the promises and the potential that they felt they would get from a Labour government have not been fulfilled. So we've all been on the receiving end of cost of living crisis and, the health system not working and so forth. It just so happens that the impact is even more severe for our communities. And I think that some of the things that we're hearing on the streets and in the communities in terms of the work that we do is people are not happy with the way we're being treated. They don't like the way Diane Abbott was treated. They don't like the manner in which race legislation was promised has not come into fruition. They don't like what's not happened on the promise of deliverance from the Windrush scandal. We've got a good commissioner in there. At the same time, it needs the will of government to ensure that things move through. So time and time again, what they are saying is that it's almost like when they're away from power, they collaborate. But the closer to the proximity to power, and then when they're in power, they're not needed anymore.
Ah, the
I'm
the
just
old
saying.
the old meme with
I'm
the
just saying,
cats.
yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying what people are saying in our community. I can give you, as someone who's done a lot of this work over many, many years, my opinion, and I hope there's some validity to that. But you can't go against the opinion of and the soundings that are coming from communities, and they manifest themselves in votes or the lack of votes. People are becoming really despondent with politics in general. But when you look at the news, you look at the commentary over here, but also in other parts of the world, this is global. So, when you look at the States and you hear what is being said about us, when you see that things are happening in communities and nothing is being said. I grew up in an area called Arnold in Nottingham, and I received my first racial attack and bad policing when I was in Arnold just a few weeks ago. A white man in a car drove towards a group of young Black men, and one of those boys was murdered. Most people haven't heard about that. What about what happened in Dublin just the other day, where some security guards, almost another George Floyd incident, was killed on the streets in plain view? So what's happening is that our realities and our pain is not manifesting itself in terms of what the media are saying and what the politicians point towards. So that might be good business for you as podcasters, because people are coming to you to listen to that. But that should be as well as what's happening in the mainstream media. So I'm not a pessimist. I mean, I grew up and I worked with privileged to work with people across the borders like Jesse Jackson, whose mantra was keep hope alive, and we have to keep hope alive. But you've got to agree with me that what is happening now is really, really worrying. And there is a responsibility for all of the political parties. And at the moment, we're talking about the Labour who are in government, and Labour who have been the traditional home of our communities in terms of the vote and what they could rely upon to do something about this. But it's also our responsibility as well. And that's why Operation Black Vote and other organizations, but we're speaking about Operation Black Vote, is so important, because what we are saying is that you can't just point. It's like my mother, my late beautiful mother used to say, you point a finger there and there are three fingers pointing back at you. Focus on.
That's
My
a
mother
very,
used
that's a very old proverb from our
Nigerian
part of the
side
world.
of the family, they say the Nigerian proverb. My mother said it was a character. I don't know, work it out, but it's a good one.
No, it is.
And so,
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back far enough, we have a shared ancestry. So it's clear, at least it's clearly a West African proverb, because in at least 3 languages that I know of within Nigeria, that proverb is native to those languages. So it's clearly a West African proverb that has deep roots. And my experience in life has shown it to be quite true.
Yeah. So that means then that actually in a democracy, we have to accept that there is a responsibility that we have to get involved. And that's why those programs around, how do you become a counsellor, and how can you realize the power that you have in becoming a counsellor? How can you join residence forums and recognize the importance you can have at ward level, and we've had people in our communities that have said, well, we can't do anything about it. And we've encouraged them, join a political party or residence forum and so forth. And they've managed to get, with pride, our younger people as well, potholes dealt with, bins collected, keeping community centres and provisions open. And when people realise, actually, I can influence this, well, they can do this at a regional level. You can do this at a national level. So for me and my colleagues at the moment in Operation Black Vote, and I dare say some of the other organisations, we're leading transition. We've got a transition towards younger people, for which there is a lot of talent and a lot of positive ideas and new ways of doing things, to take that mantle over, and not just to enjoy the title of leadership, but to do something. And we can, because often in times of chaos, which this is, it's national and international chaos. When you read back about what happened, it's in moments like this that the difference is made. And that's why it's so urgent. Yeah. Are you with me on that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I agree with you on that conversation around the changing attitude depending on one's proximity to power. In fact, one of the things that were thrown up in the early days of the immigration white paper was the videos and memes of the current Home Secretary's protest against treatment of migrants when Labour was in the opposition, and to then juxtapose it with the language that's coming out now. So and I think that's also one of the things that makes people in our communities look at politics, look at politicians and say, what, you're going to say whatever you want, whatever feels good at any point in time, depending on what the stakes are. And people then just throw their hands up in the air and like, I give up. Yeah. But if we go back a bit to the to jury trials, one of the things you've said is that trial by jury is one of the last democratic protections ordinary citizens have against the power of the state. Removing that right retrospectively sends a clear message: safeguards are conditional. Now, that is, it's not just specific, but it also seems to be part of a pattern that's emerging. So jury trials are want to be applied retrospectively. The changes to the settlement conversation are looked at being applied retrospectively. So the question then is this a specific message that is being sent to a community that is going to be most affected by these policies that it doesn't really matter. We're going to apply laws that may affect you, but then we're going to choose the time in which those laws are going to become active rather than what should be commonplace, which is from when it's passed. We're going to say, for these laws that affect your community, we're going to go back in time and, going back again to what you had said earlier, that if you don't vote, politicians don't have to listen to you. So is there like a correlation where the government is saying, we're going to do this, but because we don't have to listen to you, we're going to do it anyway?
Yeah, well, yes, is a short answer to that. But it's less about what people say and what they intend, and more about the effect. So whatever is said or not said, the effect of these policies and legislation is impacting negatively on us. And if you have conversations, and I'm going across the board in all of the parties, they will say, oh, no, that's not the intention. But if it's the effects, that's what we have to deal with. The great Muhammad Ali boxer once said, he said something like, if you see a host of sharks coming towards you, you're not going to work out whether all of you are intending to hurt me or not. You're going to get out of the way of it because they're sharks. And I think it's the same thing. We've got to just recognize now that legislation coming towards us is harming us, whatever the politicians are saying. So the point about getting involved and getting engaged is really, really important. I've worked with the major parties, and they're not bad people. 100% of them aren't bad. There are some good people in the system that want to work, but they require our leadership to make it happen. So we've got to get involved within that. So yeah, the short answer to your question is that the judge-only trials, a lot of the legislation which is looking at health and the inequalities within health, the economic strategies which are addressing the cost of living crisis, don't address the specificity of the issues that we experience. And so we will continue to be disproportionately impacted as a result of that. So we've got to get intelligent about that. If we know that is the case, what is it that we do? Because it's great to do good speeches and to point and criticize, but we're almost working on the premise that for some politicians, that they are even interested or have the values that we feel that they should all have, or the democratic values which we feel there should be. So we've got to be really thinking about how do we organize better, strategically, and engage with the system, and to stop the deterioration within the system. We've had a number of complaints and information brought to us that even where Black candidates were going out on the doorstep to try and get the votes that they were experiencing racism on the doorsteps, and high levels of racism, which was not being challenged by the police at the time. So there's almost a normalization of that. So if you bring your democratic right to try to be elected to bear, that for some people in our communities who might be supporting things that the majority might want, it's fine. But for others, no, it's not fine, and are subject to discrimination, to racism, to attack, to bullying, to harassment, and crime.
Okay. I mean, so for the records, I'm on the same side as you largely with respect to jury trials, especially because I know for a fact that my first problem with judge-only trials is it actually increases the scope of corruption. It's something that we have seen coming from West Africa, where jury trials are not the norm. It becomes easy to intimidate or to outright bribe a judge. It becomes a magnitude easier. So I understand that. However, I want to juxtapose it with a quote that was made by Lee Kuan Yew back in 1977. Lee Kuan Yew, in many respects, for those of us who come from a global South background, is the epitome of somebody who can actually, or who actually he did it. He moved his country basically from third world to first world, and he wrote the book. But he said something along the lines of that jury trials may work in a homogeneous society, that an ethnically homogeneous society, but not in multi-ethnic or multiracial societies, because it is unlikely that each juror will set aside his race, language, and religion. And one of the reasons why that began to play in my head is that I've been privy to a trial recently, and it's so the people who are on trial are Black. Um, Four of the jurors are Black, and one of the jurors was recently removed from the trial during jury deliberation because that juror was bullying a white juror was bullying a Black juror. So having that context, something that I'm privy to, and all of that, and that's in this country, it makes me begin to ask that question, and I think it's a question that we need to consider. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Mhm. I mean, there will always be in any system things that might go wrong. People that act corruptly, that will always happen. But I suppose if we go to the bare point about having judges only preside over, let's say, they're criminal cases in a system where Black people are more likely to be arrested than white, stop and searched. We're more likely to receive harsher sentences than white people. Within every single sphere of the criminal justice system, we're more likely to be at the worst end of it. To have a system where only 1% of judges are Black and 99% of that are white and continue to preside over that, the law of averages tells you that we stand less of a chance unless there's a jury which can actually look at the case in the round and have some diversity on that and have Black people on those juries as well. You will always get Black people that do what we talked about earlier, who move against their communities. That will always happen. But the law of averages and the safety to ensure that, the democratic principles continue and that racism isn't just presiding in one person means that it is so important that we have jury trials and multiracial juries as well. So I'm
Okay.
not taking away the point that you've made, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying, David Lammy, as the Foreign Secretary now and Home Secretary at the time, he was the person that did some brilliant work in saying, no, we've got to have multiracial jurors. We have to have jury trials. And he's the person now who is moving Labour in a different direction. So it comes back to your point, and Ndukwe. It comes back to your point that, politicians flip and change their minds. But we know this is a real fundamental right that Black people require, and it shouldn't be changed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So let's move on to the um basically to some of your experience on the inside. You advised two senior government officer ministers between 2005 and 2008, was it? And I mean, that's about the end of the Blair era and the beginning of Brown era. Can you tell us about what you saw from the inside of government,
Yeah.
especially with respect to how Black and minority ethnic communities were actually thought about, if they were thought about at all?
Yeah, okay. So it was more towards the beginning of the Blair era. So it was when Labour were in opposition and then a couple of years in. So that was the period. And so working with Home Office ministers and the Home Secretary at the time around the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the Deputy Home Secretary at that time. And I think what you had there was, the same thing, really, that a recognition that because the facts bore it out, that we were victims of racism right across the spheres. I think because of the time the Stephen Lawrence situation was there and there were conversations about whether there should be an inquiry or not, there was an awakening. And Black organizations were much more united and vocal about what was important in terms of a new Labour government coming in. And I was responsible for, when they were in opposition, having the Home Office ministers or shadow ministers at the time and the wider Labour Party going up and down different parts of the country and speaking to Black communities. And it became clear that Black communities were talking about mobilising, that the Stephen Lawrence issue was an important one. There'd been murders before, Roland Adams and so forth, and this was not acceptable. And I think what you had was Labour saying, and Labour recognising the importance of liaising with and keeping communication with Black communities. We also had the Black MPs at the time, who were the 4 Black MPs, Bernie Grant and Diane Abbott and Paul Boateng, and also Keith Vaz, also really united within that. So what it showed them, and when communities got together, and when communities were very clear about the issues, then government would have to listen. And we were also speaking about the power of the vote at that time as well. So I think what you found was, again, proximity to power, being further away, let's talk. And then as Labour came into power and got into power, I'm not saying things weren't done. There were some good things done, definitely some good things done, but there's almost a reverting to type that takes place. We're in power now, we got this, almost a reverting to type. But I think even now, Sexter, is that government knows, they know, they've got the stats, they've got the data. It's no longer, and we're living in a time now of, multiple truths and, falsehoods and all the rest of that. Fake news, yeah, fake news and so forth. So it's almost like, a politician could say to you something and they know, they're lying, and you both know this is a whole host of lies, but it doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter anymore. So we almost have to look at, okay, what is right, what is ethical, but not recognize that not everybody cares, and that's why it's so important that we're taking matters into our own hands as well. So the question is, what was the situation like? Well, yes, Labour understood, the whole society understood, but it's about what actions were taken. And I think what we have found is over the years, there's been a less focused attention on issues of anti-racism. Seminal moments happen. Stephen Lawrence, George Floyd, and then people wring their necks to say, this should never happen again. But then the more you move away from the further you move away from those seminal moments, is the more that the systems revert to type. And we should know that by now. And that's why it's really up to us to look at how do we get involved? Do we make sure that our leadership takes a hold so it changes? The analysis is just tired. I'm tired. You started this whole thing by saying, are you tired? Yes, I'm tired. I'm really tired. I was speaking to someone the other day, and I often recall this, back in lockdown, and I was with my father having a meeting, by a Zoom meeting, and he was in the background. And then I was having this meeting, and I looked at him, and he had this funny look on his face. The meeting was about anti-racism, that kind of stuff, Operation Black Vote meeting, I think. He was in the background. He has a funny look on his face. And when I came off the call, I says, "Dad, what's the matter?" And he said, "You're still talking about this in that way. It's tiring." So that's it. I'm tired. A lot of us this age are tired. Yeah. And our younger people are looking to take that mantle, but to do it in a different way. And we've got to be supporting that. And that's why podcasts and what you do is so important. But we shouldn't give up. We've come a long way since those days of enslavement. So it is wrong to give up, but it equally is wrong just to analyze the problem and not to analyze what the solutions should be.
Yeah.
And the solutions are very, very clear, actually. We've got to fight for a democracy that doesn't deteriorate. We've got to deal with what we have now. And that's why registering to vote and being strategic about how we vote and having that engagement with our communities is so important. Because I'm kind of tired of these kind of conversations that are not solutions focused. It's an insult to mental health.
Yeah.
And it's an insult to a lot of people's mental health around this, actually. And there are allies as well. There are white working class communities that have been told that actually it's them. And then when they realize, because initiatives take place where we're getting together, where they realize, well, actually, you're not the enemy. Your experience is actually probably worse than ours. And you can use other ways of doing that. You can use culture, you can use entertainment, you can just have hard conversations. And that's one of the things that Operation Black Vote and other organizations have been doing is having those conversations and looking at, well, what do we have in common? That's not taking away the specificity of race. It's not. It's saying that if this is our noble cause, we need to get here. Well, actually, you see it all over the world where politicians and political leaders have got involved. In West Africa and in other places, Hutsis and Tutsis, where they've been living side by side and into each other's homes and so forth, all over the world, and political leaders get involved and they're decapitating each other months later. Well, what's that about? Now, it might seem like I'm exaggerating the point. Maybe I'm exaggerating the point to make the point that this is about political leadership, political choices and ethics, and it's also about people realizing that you do need to forge alliances as well. That is really important. That's without diluting the necessity of Black. I was brought up on the political leadership principles of Malcolm X, so, but that does not go away from saying, actually, if you can forge allegiances and alliances, because things are getting so bad for a lot of people, then that's the thing to do. And that can come across classes as well, who might be the people that can support you, who are in those middle class positions, who are in government. I mean, you know this, there's some decent people that just want the support.
Yeah.
So we just got to be a little bit more savvy about it and more solutions focused about it.
And
Speaking of alliances, okay.
That's quite interesting. I don't, because you spoke about, and I think maybe that's what wants to happen on as well, the alliances thing. I remember just when I started, when I started getting a lot more active in labor, and we're talking about the non-involvement of the Black community in Derby in labor policies. I remember speaking to an MP then, serving MP, and saying, look, this is the issue. Why is there no support from your end for our communities? And what she said stopped me in my tracks, because I knew instinctively how true it was. She said, look, I've tried to get a lot of your people involved, but people just want to pray. And it's two different things. You just want to pray, but you don't want to get active. So I can't do anything. And for me, I mean, it goes back to what you just said, talking about the situation, but not the solution. And for me, it was the same thing, because one of the places where we mobilize a lot in our communities, the churches, or through, some of the social groups. And I remember having similar conversations with some of the leaders, religious leaders then, and everyone had a good line. Everyone can quote a quick Bible verse, but for the most part, it ends there. So there's that as well. And when you said I'm tired, I chuckled a bit, because it reminded me of the first very, very first conversation we had, because that was your quote. You just said, "Look, I'm tired," and I can see that frustration, because I can imagine. I've just been involved in politics here for just about 5 years. You've done this for for a lot longer than I have. And if we're coming back to have this same conversation, that means it's not that nothing is moving, but at least the progress is taking longer.
Yeah.
And but again, the question I'll then ask is, do you think disengagement is something of a rational or perhaps irrational response or to a political system that has consistently failed to deliver? In which case, people say, my grandfather knocked on the door, it wasn't open. My father knocked on the door, now I'm knocking on the door. You know what? Screw it. I'm done. I'm tired. And unlike you, who, you say you're tired, but the passion doesn't let you let go. There are others who will say, I'm tired and I'm done, and they cut off.
Yeah.
So would you say, would you blame anyone for that? I have my thoughts, but
Yeah. Well, I think I'm tired, but it's not acceptable to be tired and do nothing about it. Tired, get some sleep, get some supplements, do some push-ups and get on with it. I've been fickle about it. But that's why they call it struggle, because struggle means struggle. And you've also got to look at some of the improvements that we've made. You know, I'm the descendant of people that were enslaved, and the things that they had to do to get. And people often don't like talking about slavery and so forth, but this is the trajectory. This is where we're coming from. I look at what our parents did in the 60s and the 50s, and they struggled through when it was even more explicit, although it's getting that way again now. Do you know what I mean?
It's been normalized.
It's not an option. You've got to keep hope alive. We were not biologically predisposed to this. Do you know what I mean? So it's almost, I had a really good white friend, and he died not so long ago. And I remember him just saying to me, he says, every time I think about your life and my life, everything is through the prism of the color of your skin. And I just get up in the morning, I think, what am I doing tonight? Yeah, I'll go to the Dog and Beer and have a pint with the guys. And but he just saw close up. Now, when I visited Nigeria for the first time as a young man, and I spoke to a woman who had just turned 100, and she asked me what I do. And I was explaining to her, she just couldn't understand this whole notion of through the prism of the color of my skin on that basic level every day that I'm existing through that. I then began to realize this is sick. Racism is a sickness, and we cannot tolerate that. But we've got to understand that we've also made advances as well. There've been times where along the struggle, we've made powerful advances right against the odds. The business of life is to be happy. So part of it for me is I want to wake up, I want to be happy. And I do find times of happiness. I've got to realize my relative advantage in comparison to many people in our communities as well. So I just think, we're going to normalize this a little bit. What are the conversations that we have with our families, with our friends? What kind of advice do we give? How do we show up in supporting on a micro level? How do we build each other's confidence? And these things matter. If I was a politician and I was looking for votes, and I had a whole host of people like me standing over there, and it was too late because I'd missed the deadline for registering to vote. Yes, Wharton, cool. But I'm going over here to try and see what I can influence. It's as stark as that. Our analysis of the problem is beautiful and needs to continue, but that isn't in of itself good enough. But what can be done in Derby? Which roads can we go to? How can some people in Derby who have friends and relatives in Nottingham and other part of the East Midlands combined region coalesce to make a difference at a regional level? Because you've had regional government in the East Midlands. So why Derby people over here and Nottingham people over here and over there are not speaking to each other? It's not rocket science. And I've sat down with, because I do a lot of work with the political leaders and so forth, who, when they've had a drink and they get comfortable with me, will just say, bloody hell, Dave, it's not rocket science. It isn't. And they say it's in a, not in a way that is meant to be disrespectful. But the effect of it is actually, yeah, it might be disrespectful, but actually it's more of a comment on what we aren't doing, what we should be doing. Do you see what I mean? So I could sit here and be really sort of correct about the way that I'm articulating to you in very sort of Black leadership organizational terms. Yeah, but no, we're having a conversation here. So I suppose what I'm trying to appeal to is all of us to each one do something, each one tell one. Let's have these conversations and let's try and make it into action. How can we use the music scene? So, just the other day, there was a reunion of Pink Coconut, and I used to be a Nottingham lad, and I used to go to Pink Coconut in Derby, and there are a number of people that are still involved in that. They're actually quite influential in their way in community organizations and so forth. How about as part of that, there's like a little bit of a statement or some appeal or some encouragement or some information given? There's different ways in which we can do this thing. And, having the conversation is important. but not in and of itself,
Mm.
unless we're looking at what it is that we do. And there's a lot of things that we can do.
Okay.
So I understand what
Yeah.
your member of parliament is saying, but he or she also has a responsibility, notwithstanding that, because it's not just about the votes, to look at what they're doing within the 4 years or the 5 years that they have, where, you know, it's leadership as usual. They're not just thinking about this stuff. And I'm not saying I don't know particular circumstances of this person, but it happens too often where we see members of parliament, sometimes councillors, have a bit of a unique interest in this particular issue because it's coming up to election time. It's not good enough.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
you've given quite some advice to the community. And I think this is a good time to just basically talk about, or let's have you talk about the Operation Black Book OBV. Especially given that our audience includes a lot of African heritage people who are first generation migrants. Uh, I prefer to call us expats, or the second generation children of expats. So OBV has been historically most associated with Black Caribbean communities, but do you think it can pivot or to expand to include direct African heritage communities?
Yeah. I mean, we've always had West African and some East African, not so much, but involvement in the organisation from the start. It is right to say that because of the nature of politics at that time, 30 years ago plus, that the involvement of the African diaspora wasn't as much as the Caribbean diaspora. But I think that if you look at the Nigerian community, there's so much potential and power in that community alone. West African generally. You know, we do initiatives as part of extension of Operation Black Vote in Uganda, and we've done some I've personally worked in Nigeria and in Ghana, where some of these issues have been raised, and where we look at what additionality can we have, because we're recognizing our power. The Nigerian community in this country has a lot of power. So for us, it's also have been about bringing on board. So we're doing a board recruitment not so long from now. And that's something that I'm specifically looking at, but also looking at strategically, how can we use that power that there is within all our communities and within African communities to bear to help the struggle. Often political parties are using it for the wrong reasons. You know, if I'm not going to be specific about it, but you're seeing members of our Nigerian community, and I have a Nigerian lineage as well, you know, that have been utilized coming from a different type of politics and bringing it here, and it's completely off beam and it's not working. But the potential is that we have more of that involvement, demonstrating the economic wealth, the power, and some of that that's positioned in this country as part of the strategy for Operation Black Vote and other organizations that are addressing the issue of anti-racism and equity and human rights in this country. So the point that you're making is an important one. I mean, Operation Black Vote talks on the premise of, when we first started, African, Caribbean, and Asian unity. That's what's on our vision. But we recognize that there are differences in between, but there's more that unites us than divides us. We've also got to be conscious of the nature and the application of the politics now that seeks to divide. And it's a numbers game, a lot of this, because I might disagree with you, I might disagree with some of my Asian colleagues, but actually in this particular context, is that disagreement more important than the agreement about getting rid of this germ called racism? Well, actually, no. It's important to unite on that basis, but at the same time, to look at where those differences might be. But I think that, and Dukra, you made the point early about where we're coming from. My name's not Weaver. My surname is Weaver, but that's not my name. If I did my family tree as a young person and could only get so far, and then recognize that it was somewhere across there on the continent, on the African continent. So there's more that there's when I go to Nigeria, when I go to Ghana and I speak to some of the older ones, and then I go to the Caribbean, Antigua, Jamaica, and speak to some of the old ones the same age, you couldn't, some of the sayings, some of the thinking and so forth, you couldn't split it. So I think it's important to recognize that I'm an African. You know, I was born, the son of Caribbean parents, but I'm an African. But there's also something important about the Caribbean piece because of the experiences that were there as well, and the recognition of that struggle. But I think you make a good point, Dexter, which is, in all of these things, we recognize our power. What's our economic power? So not just coming at a deficit. What's our economic power? How do we highlight experiences that are specific to our separate communities as well, and to the African communities as well? So, Dexter, I'm sounding like one of those people that are making a point and being defensive. I'm not. I'm actually highlighting your point with an
You
explanation.
actually sound like you're psych evaluating, which reminds me that you were actually trained as a counseling psychologist.
That's a lovely
So
segue. A lovely segue. I'll allow you that. I'll allow you that one.
so let me ask you a question from that. What does psychological literature say about civic participation in communities? Communities, especially communities such as ours that have experienced repeated institutional betrayal.
Yes.
Because I would say that that's precisely where Black Britain is right now, repeated institutional betrayal. So what does psychology say about that, and how do you react?
Well, there's lots of different psychological strands and psychotherapeutic strands and so forth. I think intergenerational levels of racism have an impact on your mental health. Racism is a mental health issue. If you suffer from it, it's a mental health issue. And we've found that where people have experienced their mothers, their fathers, their loved ones experience racism, it has an impact. And it probably determines how you behave as well, and how you think about yourself. And if anyone goes on my WhatsApp, there's a statement on my WhatsApp profile which says only you can make yourself inferior. And actually, the evidence is a lot of us, no matter what we say, we'll talk about things like imposter syndrome. I don't like that terminology. About feeling inferior, about not feeling good enough. And that's transcended down because that's the system of slavery. That's what it made us do. And there's the impacts of that now, where you can talk about some discrimination and some isms, and it's accepted by society, but then you see the same thing happening to you and you don't think it's accepted by society. So the Black Lives Matter movement was born out of that. We matter. And if you're spending so much time saying, we do matter, don't we, that's a psychological thing. You're asking a question which is based on nonsense. Of course we matter. But the question is a valid one because of the psychotherapy, the psychological state we find ourselves in, the intergenerational levels of racism. So that's why the counselling professions, and when I was president of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, I said writ large that it had to address the issue of racism. And we did a number of things around that. And that counseling and psychotherapy and psychology is a critical part of that. So yes, we have to be always thinking about how are we thinking, how are we experiencing this psychologically? And we'll see that in our communities and in our families.
So let me try to do my own amateur psychological work here. I want to draw you back to your position to the move towards removing juries from trials. It would appear that there are some potential allies in the right wing among reform ads. Was Rupert Lu's outfit. Would you ally with whatever it's called? Would you ally with them, with such characters, to achieve the goal?
The enemies of my enemies aren't necessarily my friends.
Well spoken, like somebody who is used to messing with people's minds.
No, but it's true. It's true.
It is.
It is. I mean, just because you and I are united against that person doesn't mean when that person's gotten rid of, you're not going to put a knife in my back.
True. That's very true.
At the same time, sometimes it's important to look at people in other contexts that it might be useful because you do unite on something because it will help you, but be wise in so doing.
Yeah.
You know,
I completely.
I might not agree with 100% of where you're coming from, but actually, if there's a critical percentage of that is going to help, then I'll be very, very careful, but I'll do that.
Yeah.
If you can understand where the other person's coming from. So sometimes I listen to white people and I can understand why they say what they're saying is racist as it is. I can understand it because you've got the propaganda of the media, you know, they've got intergenerational levels of oppression being passed down from their parents and educating them about what they must think about Black people. You know, it's psychologically it's shown to be the case. But if you can understand where actually there might be something here where I can influence, and that's why I was saying there's often more that we have in common where we can influence, why not work with that? Now, some people might ideologically say, well, the principles of, and they misread it, Marcus Garvey or whatever, or, you know, Pan-Africanism and so on, won't say that. Well, maybe you're intellectually pure, but if I can get this person, Glenn, and your mates to vote in this particular way to get rid of that racist councillor, well, that sounds a bit like common sense to me.
Yeah.
But I think that there are some entities that they may agree that they like baked beans, but voting with them or collaborating with them is not going to help the meal.
Okay. And that's quite interesting because just before or during the last local government elections, I was in Hackney and Islington, helping out a few friends, and I remember speaking with these
Did they win?
1-1. I remember
One
speaking
out of
to.
six.
I
Poor
remember.
record.
I remember. Yeah. So, David, what you need to. Cheta is the resident anti-Labour voice in here. So.
I can see that.
So we were speaking to this black chap, you know, who was like, "Oh man, you know, I'm pro-black, I'm pro this, I'm pro that, but I'm not going to vote." And I'm like, you know, dude, first of all, if you don't vote, your voice isn't part of that conversation. But even more intriguing is here's someone who is a candidate who, like you, is also black, who, like you, also is fighting for, you know, racial justice, and who your vote can help get over the line. But you're here saying you're upset at the system because, you know, it's not going one way, but you have a candidate who's, you know, a dependable ally, who, of course, with his other colleagues as well, but you're not voting. So is that thing of, again, coming back to getting angry, being angry at the system, being able to diagnose the problem, but saying, you know what, I'm not going to be a part of trying to solve it.
Yeah, and that's the problem, and that's that in it's to not vote is a vote, and actually,
yes, this is true.
And actually, if I'm on the other side of things and you're attacking me, you can attack me as much as you like, and maybe you've won the argument ideologically. And then when it comes to, but I'm not going to vote, I'm going to just laugh right in your face. Thank you. And I move on. I will listen to your arguments with, you know, a glass of wine and I've seen it happen and just people just smile. You know what I mean? Because that's a very interesting point of view, but you're not going to do anything about it. Well, you know, you're a bigger idiot than I am. And I know I'm using those kind of terminologies and I'm having this conversation in this way because of the seriousness of the moment. And, you know, I feel more now than ever that we're living in very dangerous times because it's not just what's happening at local and national levels, it's what's happening at international levels.
Yep.
You know, when America sneezes, we catch a cold. You can see what's happening in the politics, and Chixie, you keep bringing this up, and I understand why you are. The politics on the African continent. If I look at what's happening on the Caribbean side as well, the ecosystem politically there as well, it's a really serious moment. All of the conventions, even all the protocols of behavior, of good behavior have gone. You never used to like it, you don't mean it, but they've gone. And when they've gone, it's very dangerous. Someone dies and the president says, the United States says, "Well, I'm glad they're dead," because didn't agree with them. You know, it's we're having conversations of the type that we wouldn't have 5 or 10 years ago. And when I look at my son and think, well, what kind of future is bestowed for him if we accept the normalization of this stuff? If we accept that it's acceptable that Black people that put themselves up for candidature in local and national elections, it's okay for them to be attacked physically, verbally, supported by the press. It's Councillor Chantal Lunt in the North. Google that what she's gone through has been awful. So we've got to protect democracy, because that's what we got. We've got to protect democracy, and we have to get involved and deal with it, because the trajectory does not look good, and it's happening quick. Now, I'm not scaremongering. You know, when I'm in London, I live not too far from the Britannia Hotel, which is where there were big demonstrations against asylum seekers who were living there.
Yeah.
And I remember returning home one evening, actually it wasn't evening, it was early morning, flags all over the place. And then getting into my house, not long after the asylum demonstrators were there, having to hear for over an hour people singing "Rule Britannia." Do you know what I mean? And it's people afraid to walk on the streets now. So yeah, we've had this many times in the past, but it's not been as normalized as it is now.
Yeah, and you know, the thing about the normalization of hate, as it were, is the other day I was sat at home, I was working on my computer, and someone's at the door. I caught that on my doorbell cam. So I looked at it, and first of all, I mean, because I canvass, I realized these were canvassers. So I looked at like, okay, well, I don't know these guys. And I looked at the leaflet, they were reform canvassers. On one hand, I thought, you know what, I'll just go downstairs and hear what they want to say, just so I can maybe have some quick break and have a laugh. But then instinctively, I thought, you know what, I don't want these guys knowing where I live. And because I have 2 young children as well. And for me, I just thought to myself, it shouldn't get to the point where I'm cautious. So not afraid, but I'm just cautious about engaging, because I don't want someone to then say to their mates, "Oh well, that's where that." Because I get a lot of vitriol online just for being, whether it's a Labour councillor, whether it's a Nigerian one as well. But so I understand personally when you talk about the normalization of hate and all that. And of course, we spoke about this in the last podcast, Cheta, where someone said Nigerians should be melted and used to fill potholes. And not one person, it still upsets me that we have about 6 across the parties, about 6 different members of parliament who are of Nigerian heritage. We wrote to all of them, not one response, not one person spoke up to say, this is a death threat against this community. However, we know how the story goes. If it was a different community, that someone said not even half of that, so our community now is acceptable, and perhaps it goes back to what you said, David, that because we're not voting or not getting politically engaged, then politicians don't think they don't have to listen to us or have to speak for us, because at the end of the day, what are we bringing to them in exchange? And if you listen to even though it's one of those things that upset you or upset me rather when I heard it the first time, but he did make sense. The current Nigerian president, who has a famous quote that power is not served a la carte, and as upsetting as it is real politic. You don't sit down and someone, or like a pastor said to me, look, politics is not moral. No one is going to do something for you because, oh, I like this person, let me do it. At every point in time, a decision is being weighed against either the vote you're going to get or the vote you're going to lose, or the pressure that is coming on. And if we are not willing to either put on any pressure or withhold or give a vote, then we're setting ourselves up to be constantly ignored. So what
and that's And that's why faith organizations are so important, because in the past, they've played a key role across the world where there's, and, even in Nottingham where I was brought up, in fact, just last week, there was a coalition of the black churches that met.
Yeah, I was there, and I met. I met Reverend Clive Foster, who I should say we're going to have on this podcast as well at some point in the future. But that was a good
So Clive and I were brought up together. My father's the senior minister at that church, and
interesting.
Retired now. But that church has a tradition of what they call pilgrim social action, and there are many churches that have done that. There's been a national coalition of black churches, and we have to get involved. So it has tremendous power, significant independence, financial leverage, and legitimacy. And so where you find
very important
a situation now where the far right are trying to use Christianity as leverage for extremism and hate, it's a oxymoron. But in the absence of the black churches saying, well, actually, if you want to talk about Christianity, that is not the fundamental premise of Christianity. How do we live alongside other religions? Islam is the largest religion in the world. You know what I mean? You cannot ignore it, and you cannot have a legitimization of racism through Christianity. The Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa legitimized apartheid. So you cannot have, it's ethically and spiritually wrong to stand aside and not to go fast forward and be present at a time like this. And I know there are many ministers, and you ask Clive about this when you speak to him, that want to do that and are planning to do that. And they have done that in the past as well. But now is the time where that is really, really important. And, I've gone through my professional political life saying we're living in unprecedented times. It's almost part of, if you're doing a speech for me, yeah, put that in. Now, people nod because it is meaningful, and we're in danger of, and I always say this, bequeathing to the next generation a society worse than we found it.
And I think
and then the responsibility of every generation is to leave it better than they found it. Do you know what I mean? Sorry.
I think that's one of the danger of living a society worse than it was found is one of the big dangers of our age.
So just a final question, and thank you so much for
Thanks
spending
so much,
a good hour with us. This has been a very interesting conversation. So let's say tomorrow, let's say Starmer survives the shenanigans and he's still prime minister, and he calls you and he says,
why is it shenanigans?
I love you too. I love it.
This is what I get all the time. Or let's say the drama. Let's say Starmer survives the drama because it is sort of like an episode of a political show. But he survives it, and then he says, "Well, David, I've thought about what I said earlier, especially with the Island of Strangers. I've thought about the unprecedented consequence of some of our policies, and I want to start afresh. What advice can you give me? How do I need to make things better, especially for Black Britain, and get them back into the fold?" What do you say to him?
Well, I think, and by the way, we're non-party political, so my point against Labour is not a point for anybody else. It's about the system in general. I think for Keir Starmer, for any Labour leader, or any prime minister, it's got to recognise the inalienable fact and truth that this is a multiracial society, and that people like me have every right to be here and every right to be part of that political leadership. And the reason why we're here is because of actions that they've done elsewhere, historically and even up until now. And that's why we're here. We built this country. I was born here, and that's it. And it has to be embedded as a uncontestable fact rooted into the very fabric of the vision of the Labour Party. It's got to be the vision. And then what does that mean then in terms of the mission and what you do to get us to a place where you are addressing the cost of living crisis? You're addressing the fact that the NHS system is in decline. My father is in hospital right now, and he would not have been in hospital. He would not have got the treatment that he got last week, Thursday, if I hadn't understood the system and put on a white man's voice when I had to and speak assertively to ensure that that was happening. That is unfair. And actually, no matter what these people are saying about the NHS, it is our communities that are keeping it there. So you've got to have a vision which says this is a successful Britain, which is embedded and enshrined in the fact that our multiracial diversity is a strength and that there is no hierarchy of oppression or discrimination. Your discrimination is not more important than mine, is more important than yours. Racism is a violation of human rights. And this country will succeed. This country will succeed if it recognizes that. And that doesn't mean not going to be any challenges. Of course there are. It's difficulties all around for all people. There's not going to be 4 years and we plot it right. But people need to feel that they're involved in this. People need to feel that you're not just speaking to me because you need me now. And then further downstream, I'm a point of history that can be debated in terms of what you said or what you didn't say. So I think, honestly, it is that you've got to have a you can't divorce what's happening nationally from how people feel locally. So if your antecedents are from the Middle East or from Africa or from Israel or from wherever, actually you cannot ignore that as local politicians. So the government framework needs to recognize that our diversity means responsibility in terms of how we deal and how we relate to the world in general. And then the last thing I'd say is that you have to apologize for that Island of Strangers piece. Do something that makes people feel you've done the right thing in relation to Diane Abbott. She was the first Black woman member of Parliament. And I was with Diane a couple of months ago in America. We both were together in the Jesse Jackson funeral and spoke to her. And I just looked at her and thought, no, this is, I have a responsibility as well. People aren't treated like that. So, politicians' strength, leadership strength is about recognizing where you've gone wrong. If you recognize that, then I think you would get a lot of kudos for that. Get some good Black people into the party, into your leadership, and recognize that diversity of views and opinion is a strength. Basic tenets of leadership, which is about, not everybody, you've got to be a broad church, but you have clarity of a vision. What do you stand for as an individual? And what you stand for as an individual, if Black people are recognizing that actually I'm part of that, you'll get their vote. And recognize that you're there for a period. Allow that transition so we can see a pipeline of how Black people can get involved in that, and also their leadership as well. Because whatever Labour says, you've seen Black people in the Conservative Party in leadership. You might not like it, and some might, and you've seen them in other parties as well. And come on, Labour.
Thank you very much, Damien. I think that sums it all up. And again, thank you very much for.
And I'm willing to work with them. I mean, Operation Black Vote, because we recognize, we work with all parties at that leadership phase. So it's about, working with, not just with National Operation Black Vote, there's other organizations there, and collaborate strategically and structurally, not just when things are going bad. Let's listen to the Black community now because it's all gone pear-shaped. It's, how can you help us shape our views around the economy? There's some brilliant economic minds, who are part of our community. How do we shape the health service? Get us involved when things aren't just bad. Get us involved when you're thinking, let's think innovatively. Don't just think innovatively when it's going bad. Think innovatively when actually, we've got an opportunity here to think differently. Because, one thing that I've realized, that keeps me going is in our communities, there's some brilliant minds. Honestly, there's some brilliance. That young generation, ignore them at our peril.
True that.
us as leaders and the society and the system as well. There's some brilliant minds there. My hope is with the younger people, but my hope is also that we do the right thing, and we still can. And at a time of chaos, which there is, this is the time where you muck in. You can do certain things that you wouldn't normally be able to do because it's chaotic.
Well,
and I want to be able to have in 50 years when I'm not around, or 80 years when I'm not around, maybe we can get together somehow, wherever it might be, if your spiritual thinking allows for that, and we're saying, you know what,
we did all right.
it's moved on.
Yes.
We achieved something.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Look, I
Absolutely.
have to thank you very, very much for joining us this morning, David. Especially at a time when I know your mind is also elsewhere. You mentioned that your dad is in the hospital, so please, you just know that our thoughts are with you, and of course, we'll keep in touch outside this. But thank you very, very much for making our
Thank
time
you.
to speak with us.
I appreciate it. And keep up the
Thanks
good
for
work.
coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Keep up the good work. Thanks very
Take care.
much. Yeah.
So, Cheta, how did you find that?
I found it very interesting. I mean, let's put it very bluntly. The key thing, which has been our message on this podcast from the beginning, is we can't afford not to get involved. And basically, David has reinforced that in very, very clear terms. That statement that he made right at the start, if you're not registering to vote, politicians are not listening to you. It's actually one. So I would actually draw um a corollary. I'll draw a English has failed me. So parallel is not quite the word, but
Corollary?
no, it's not quite corollary. That's why. But I'm going to draw something here. Now, if you remember back in 2010, well, we were in Nigeria at the time, but I mean, we used to follow UK politics. One thing about being in global South countries is we tend to follow the politics of global North countries a lot more closely than they follow our politics. So your average Nigerian political observer has a fair idea of what's happening in the US, in the UK, in Canada, in France. So, but US and UK most especially. So back in 2010, David Cameron was trying, and you remember this was when our sister Kemi got into politics. David Cameron was trying to appeal to the Black community. So I remember a video of him going to a Redeemed church, I think in Brent Cross in London. And Kemi leaned into her Nigerianness at the points. I think that a lot of her hostility to our community nowadays is because she quickly discovered that there's nothing coming from this community. Politically, there's no advantage. Yeah, there's no advantage to be gained by associating with the community, and there's no disadvantage to be gained by slagging off the community. So she leans into slagging us off. And that's something that's one of our problems as a people generally, is that we don't seem to introspect very much. But this is something that I think we should try to introspect about. Because it is very important.
So we created the villain called Kemi.
I wouldn't go so far as to call her a villain, but
no, when you're talking about her no, but seriously, the way she, and I think slag off is even being kind, but she always offers up the Nigerian community for.
Yes, but again, simply because there's nothing to be lost really by offering us up. See, one thing that has been proven over the last few years, whether it is in the UK, whether it is in Nigeria, whether it is in the US, attack dog politics works. When you create an enemy or something to focus people's minds on, it's actually quite effective. For her, sad to say, it's Nigeria and Nigerians. But I think that's one of the lessons to take. But I think overall, it was speaking with David was very, very worth it.
No, it was, and it's, I think this is one. I'm glad that we did, because it's not just us who are, for lack of a better phrase, new to the system, but someone who's been fighting for decades. And, if he says he's tired, even though he's not giving up, it lets us know that there's a lot
The
of
work
work
is
to be
not
done.
easy.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
easy.
I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, and this is me speaking as someone who was involved within the NGO communities in Nigeria and all of that. I am tired as well. So not quite tired in the UK, but in Nigeria tired. But there's that understanding that we are all human. Every machine will break down at some point. So you will get tired. The trick is being able to take a nap, as it were, step back briefly, and then go again after you've stepped back. I mean, I can go into, but that's a very personal thing. I can go into a screed now about how people don't let you step back, but that's another discussion entirely.
No, but I tell you what we can do. We can step back from today's episode because this has been a very long one. And
It's been long.
And if you're listening up to this point, kudos, thank you, and well done.
Thanks, and see you at the next one.
See you at the next one.